Hello, this is Missing Booster Club Funds, a case study for EDL 854, and I am Evan Manning. The first subsection that was isolated in the rubric was Category 1, Problem Identification and Analysis. It broke into two subsections, which was the what we already know and what we need to know. Specifically, starting with what we do know, we knew that Mr. Stevens, the head principal of the middle school, was not overseeing the gate. We knew that the concession funds were balanced, at least the paperwork was balanced with the concession money that went in, and we knew that the admissions gate is short $50. What we need to know: does Mrs. Bowman have any shortages on record in the past? So we have some sort of a history. 2, can we confirm the presence of the $50 bill? This was uniquely important because it sort of started the point of credibility loss for Mrs. Bowman due to the first person account from Mr. Dumas, who was the person who paid with the $50 bill, at least in passing, with the conversation with Mr. Stevens. And the $50 bill was not in the gate, so that becomes sort of the starting point for why maybe fraud is sort of the issue and not sort of just an accidental shortage. And 3, do we have the torn tickets in the collection as well? This is uniquely important, and we'll talk about that more as we continue. But again, in the Money Matters text, it was really specific about utilizing the dual-coded and dual-numbered ticket systems, and that if anything ever happens with the tickets, they can't be sold, then those tickets need to go back in with the actual gate. And if those tickets were not there, then obviously they were sold and yet the money's missing. So I think that would be a really easy thing, that if the individual principles were utilized from the text in the outline, then we would be able to solve those. But again, we don't know with that background information. And sort of the overall thesis of the problem is there fraud and an honest shortage or nothing at all? Category 2 was the proposed plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. We had to have a strategic plan of action with 3 specific isolated steps. Step 1 would be find the torn ticket stubs as should have been turned in via the gate procedure outlined in page 12 of the text. Step 2, if tickets don't exist, get the follow-up statement from Mr. Dumas about the $50 bill, because until that's sort of double-checked and reified, there's not really a reason to go directly to Mrs. Bowman and poke the bear, if you will. And step 3, talk with Mrs. Bowman about what happened, specifically if step 1 and 2 are not resolved. Again, a lot of what we're going to talk about is about sort of a post scenario and isn't really getting into the preventative measures, which I think could have definitely changed, but that really wasn't what was asked. But one of the things that I would probably add as a hypothetical for, as far as what to actually do if you were sort of thought contesting as being the principal, would be to have some sort of a secondary person at the initial count, so that way there wasn't the miscommunication or the risk of loss between the count and when Mr. Stevens had the bag before he took it out to the car. Category 3 was about problem solving, specifically about resolving those issues based upon promoting the success to all students. So sort of try to talk about the way in which that this can still affect student use specifically. There were 3 warrants isolated. The first would be students need access to solve the missing funds. And that's intervention solves. So again, I think that ultimately at a very starting point sort of question, the students are the ones who get the money for their own uses. And if that goes away, that obviously directly affects the ability for students to succeed. 2, we need to find out if there is a shortage or fraud. Again, step 1 of the problem-solving solution, as outlined in 2, solves that back, specifically the first step. And that really makes sure that students are protected from the potential blame that could come if we didn't solve this now, because obviously it's easier to blame them, at least stereotypically, than it would be the people that you had in charge. And 3, the follow-up meeting with Mr. Dumas can make sure accuracy before confronting a parent who is helping often. And again, that person is related to students. The category 4 is talking about the debrief of the problem by reflecting on what you were thinking for that feedback and feeling of valuing and identifying those issues for further investigative purposes. sort of 4 subsections here that were isolated in the rubric. The first was thinking. I would be thinking things should have been better early. Again, I already talked about that a little bit, and there's really a lot of steps isolated in the text, specifically in the admissions tickets section, which was subsection 2, under the reporting admissions ticket sales and the event financial reports that they give us, that just weren't really done in the same way that I would want as far as that accountability standard. 2 is the plan of liability. So is the things that we are going to do potentially have liability risks to the school. And 3 is the risk of parent complaint. Obviously with Mrs. Bowman, there probably is if you functionally call her out for theft without really knowing and checking all your bases first. As far as feeling, again, unrelated to maybe solving the problem would be, is this the first time that these issues are coming up? Do we have a larger issue at hand, sort of in the cultural aspect of the school with the theft or dishonesty? And again, what could have been better to stop all of this in the first place? So sort of a cross-application of the thinking, but also into sort of a feeling of self-doubt, at a later time. As far as individual aspects to value, privacy, consistency, and communication would be things that I would want to really prioritize in this moment with the case study. And then unresolved or open issues, obviously the truth about Mrs. Bowman, especially with the backstory of the state cheer issues and either the absolute sort of unfortunate events and connection between needing money, not being told no, and then money disappearing, as well as 2, the truth about the tickets that were missing, and 3, sort of the messy oversight needs better solvency. Like those things have to get fixed so that these things don't reoccur. Lastly is category 5, which is the reflection on standard 8. Obviously not just to reread this, I input the individual quotation that the R.L. Green text indicates there, and you can pause here if you want to read it fully. Specifically the components, though, that were talked about with effective and efficient management. First would be better initial setup. Again, having multiple people be in charge, having the count, have the financial report documentation happen earlier, looking back through that for consistency. Better oversight of the time was 2. This was specifically not talking about just sort of the who's doing what, but specifically the fact that Mr. Stevens or Principal Stevens wasn't even really watching the gate or the concessions. He was sort of doing his own thing. And obviously, yeah, that's difficult in the small school setting to not have the assistants there, as the case study indicated, but it is still uniquely important that that oversight has to exist. Otherwise, you're always going to be playing catch up if loss happens. And step 3, communication throughout. Again, whether it's with Mr. Dumas, whether it's with Mrs. Bowman, whether it's with the individual students or teachers that are involved, all that has to happen and be very open. Component 2 was talking about social learning of students. I kind of wanted to focus on being safe for the students themselves in the school with the culture. Obviously, the fair and the needs for Mr. Stevens. Again, yes, you want to be fair for him, but you also need to be fair for the needs that he had in the position that he was put in. Again, at some point, you almost have to blame yourselves if it's a school board setting scenario and you put him in a situation where he can't be at 3 places at once. That obviously would need to change to betterly and effectively solve or preempt that problem. And then safe and fair to Mrs. Bowman. I mean, as it is right now, you're not law enforcement directly, and but at the same time, you do want to find out what's going on, and I think that's sort of a line that has to be carefully tread. Component 3 is academic learning of all students. A lot of this wasn't directly talked about in the text, but I think that there's some extrapolation that can occur through academic learning and sort of the simulation of Module 16. The first was communication modeling. This goes back to some previous classes where we talk about how you need to be the model of that communication and maturity as the principal, and obviously that communication that we talked about needed to happen with sort of what you value could be there for students in academic learning. Second is, again, the funds being used eventually for needs of students. If those are gone because of loss and bad organization through the culture of the school that the principal sets up, then those are lost opportunities for students. And then one thing that I don't know isn't specifically isolated, but that students could lead programs. So that could sort of subsume the current role that's happening with the parent support. I know that in later chapters of the Money Matters text, it indicates how student groups and student stores are things, and maybe having students have the opportunity to make mistakes, but also to learn from them through the ability to take GATE and things like that might be interesting. I'm not exactly sure what the liability of that, but that'd be something that you could extrapolate as a potential academic learning opportunity from the module. So, all of that being said, I hope I covered everything, especially that was uniquely isolated in the rubric. I'd like to thank you. My references are above. Thank you again.